Welcome back to Hardball. Ever since the Supreme Court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, we've been keeping an eye on the ripple effects. Within hours of the court's decision, 3 states that had been covered, Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama, ushered in photo ID requirements that had been previously held at bay by the Voting Rights Act. In North Carolina, the Republican governor is expected to sign a bill limiting early voting and voter registration opportunities and broadening ID requirements any day. And now there's Florida, where 5 counties had been covered by the Voting Rights Act. The Republican governor is restarting an effort that he says is designed to purge the voter rolls of non-citizens, but that a lot of people believe is an attempt to purge the voter rolls of Democrats. When Rick Scott tried this last year, he was stopped by the Voting Rights Act. Last time, as the New York Times reports, the attempt at unearthing non-citizens initially began with a pool of 182,000 names of potential non-citizens. That was winnowed to a list of 2,600. Those named were sent to election supervisors who found that many were in fact citizens, and ultimately the list of possible non-citizen voters shrank to 198. Of those, fewer than 40 had voted illegally. We'd like to remind you of one of the people who was caught in the dragnet.
Bill Internicola, a 91-year-old Army veteran of World War II who earned the Bronze Star and the Legion of Honor for his service, is one of the voters targeted by the state as a potential non-citizen and was ordered to prove his citizenship or lose the right to vote.
I was amazed when I got the letter. I've been voting since I was 18 years old or what it was. And I never had any trouble. I have voted here for the last almost 15 years right here. To me, it's like an insult.
If the events in these states are any indication, there will surely be more attempts to limit voting rights, since this Congress is unlikely to fully restore the Voting Rights Act. Joining me, Democratic National Committee Chair and Florida Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Wendy Weiser of the Brennan Center for Justice. Congresswoman, I think that Dr. Norman Ornstein is a real smart guy. He's an expert on Congress, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and he recently published and outlined recommendations for a new national voting rights Act. Let me tell you what some of the component parts are. He recommends a separate federal ballot. He thinks that we should have no more confusing butterfly ballots. There'd be no more than 3 races on the ballot. There'd be no more provisional ballots. In a word, there'd be uniformity. He also thinks there should be a new voter registration regime, that the default should be that eligible citizens are presumed registered. He thinks that we should have a weekend election day, a 24-hour period from noon Saturday to noon Sunday, with early voting the week before, and he thinks that a Social Security card should be recognized as a valid form of voter ID. What thoughts do you have on that proposal?
Well, the thoughts that I have on the notion that we should be making voting easier rather than harder is a notion that I fully embrace and that our party fully embraces. Democrats have stood for years on the idea that we should be making the process of voting easier and give more access to the franchise, not less. While Republicans, on the other hand, as you've seen recently, systematically have made it a legislative priority across the country to make voting harder. And in my state, to take your example that Rick Scott has gone through with the potential purging of so-called non-citizen voters, that amounts to about, on that 180,000 person list, 0.02% of the names on that list came up as non-citizens. Not exactly a glaring problem. And 60% of those, Michael, were targeted on that list were Hispanic, when only 13% of our electorate is Hispanic. So clearly, they're not only trying to purge voters, they're trying to purge certain kinds of voters.
Congresswoman, superficially, this would seem like a no-brainer, that of course Congress is going to take action. I look at the fact that at the time of the last reauthorization in 06, the vote in the House was 390 to 33. In the Senate, it was 98 to 0. I assume because no one wants to be the individual who's held accountable for having voted against the Voting Rights Act. But at a time when it comes to do the heavy lifting behind the scenes, this can be torpedoed. Isn't that what's going on?
Well, Michael, I was on the Judiciary Committee during that entire process of reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, and there was some resistance by Republicans, but essentially, the Republicans were in charge. They actually pushed through the Voting Rights Act reauthorization. Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican from Wisconsin, was the chairman, and he has embraced the idea that we should revise Section 4, make sure we respond to the Supreme Court's constitutional concerns, and revamp the Voting Rights Act so that we can make sure that we make the franchise something that everybody has access to, not do what Republican governors and legislatures have done across the country systematically since then, which is in 30 states introduce 55 different measures to actually make it harder for people to vote and make it harder for certain kinds of voters to vote.
Wendy Weiser, shy
Hispanic
of Congress reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, what can be done?
It's critical in the first instance that Congress do something to put back in place the protections that were lost in the Voting Rights Act. We need to have some way to block discriminatory voting changes before they go into effect, before they mar an election. But there are also other critical steps that Congress should be taking to improve the voting process for all Americans. We do have a messed up system in many ways that's keeping people waiting in lines 1, 2, 7 hours. And chief among them is really upgrading our voter registration system.
But it's not just, as you well know, because at the Brennan Center you track all this information, it's not just the states that were affected by the Voting Rights Act. Look at my home state, Chris's home state of Pennsylvania, and what's taking place in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania wouldn't have been affected by the Voting Rights Act, which is why I think of Dr. Ornstein and him saying, we really do need to do something on a national level to right this ship.
We really do need to have national protections, and there are, in fact, national protections against voting discrimination and that protect voting rights. There are some places where the problems are so persistent and so constant that we need to have greater protections to be able to stop them before they go into effect, and that's what Congress found in 2006. Just last year alone, we had 17 discriminatory voting changes blocked by the Department of Justice and courts, 17 in those states, which does pale in comparison to what we saw in the rest of the country.
Thank you, Wendy Weiser. Congresswoman, I know you're in New Hampshire. If you go to Iowa next, we're going to have a big story here.